You are listening to Thick Thighs and Murder Vibes, a true crime podcast. Join us as we uncover untold pieces of the puzzle to give you all the dark and juicy details.
Each episode will take you down the rabbit hole as we dive deep into real-life murders, unsolved mysteries, and sinister crimes. This podcast does contain explicit content and graphic descriptions. Listener discretion is strongly advised. Welcome back, accomplices. It's a busy weekend where we are. There is Lilac City Comic Con going on. It's Pride weekend, so happy Pride to our LGBTQ listeners. And it's our 10th episode. Whoop, whoop. It doesn't even seem like it started that long ago. It's been almost 3 months now.
That's insane.
Yeah.
If you remember, back in episode 1, we covered the massacre of the Rupert family. We had mentioned that 20 years later, there was another murder that took place across the street from the Rupert house. We promised that we would cover the case in a future episode, and we are keeping that promise.
In honor of 10 episodes, we are doing a deep dive into the Tina Mott case. Because this is a deep dive, we will be giving you every detail we could find about Tina, her killer, and the events that took place on the night of June 4th, 1996. Additional warning, as this episode does contain graphic and in-depth descriptions, listener discretion is advised.
Tim's adoptive parents wanted nothing more than to have a child, but they weren't physically able to. Before Tim came along, Howard and Elizabeth Bradford had tried adoption the traditional way, but the state wouldn't approve their application because Howard was a construction worker who moved around a lot. It was considered a job that didn't offer much when it came to stability. With no other option available, the couple contacted a private individual for assistance in finding a newborn. It was through this individual that they were introduced to a 20-year-old drug addict from Tulsa, Oklahoma, who was about to give birth and would gladly give up the child to them or anyone else that wanted it.
She just really didn't want the kid.
Yeah, just get it away from me. Howard and Elizabeth waited patiently at the hospital for their baby boy to be delivered. On September 12th, 1971, Timothy Allen Bradford was born. There were many complications as the infant came into the world malnourished and weighing only 4 pounds, 13 ounces. His skull was not completely formed and he was experiencing severe respiratory issues. The baby's chances for survival were extremely slim. The doctor left the delivery room to inform the couple of the devastating news that the baby they had wanted and waited so long for was not expected to live through the night. Minutes turned into hours and hours into days. Doctors were amazed that against all odds, the baby was slowly gaining strength, and 1 week later, the Bradfords were finally able to take their bundle of joy home to Hamilton, Ohio. Tim had a great childhood, and the Bradfords did all they could for him, especially Howard, who not only longed for a child, but even more so wanted a boy. The father and son duo were inseparable. Howard taught Tim everything he knew about hunting, fishing, and camping. He brought Tim along on outdoor survivalist adventures. One in particular was an outing to a remote area near Rifle, Colorado, in the wintertime, where the boy learned how to track, hunt, skin, butcher, and cook wild deer on an open campfire. Tim was only 5 years old at the time of this trip. Howard also taught Tim the importance of gun and knife safety, and he taught him how to live off the land. Survival was the name of the game, and Howard was an expert. After all, he was a long-standing member of Living History, a group that educated the public about life in pioneer times. Out of everything the group taught and had to offer, knives were the thing that held Tim's interest. He was good with them and kept one with or near him at all times. Tim could easily turn a block of scrap wood into a replica of an eagle, a bear, or even a small statue of a Native American chief with a full headdress, though his specialty was making flutes from ordinary tree branches. The tone of his handcrafted instruments was clear and pure like something out of a factory. I guess you could say knives and carving were a big part of his life. In spite of all the love and attention from his parents, Tim had his fair share of problems. He was feeling like an outsider even in his own home. He was a mixed-race child living with white parents, and it led to teasing and bullying from the other kids at Tim's school. Determined to overcome the mockery, Tim set out on his own. He answered a help-wanted ad to sell magazines and books with a company that employed a group of young people like himself. This is where he met a striking young woman named Tina Mott. Tim was drawn to Tina's good looks, long blonde hair, full lips, model-like cheekbones, and perfect smile. Tina's bubbly personality is what most people noticed first, and she was an absolute joy to be around, but behind her wide smile and cheerful personality was an unhappy young woman.
Tina Elaine Mott was born on February 21st, 1975, in North Tonawanda, New York, not too far from Buffalo. She had a traumatic childhood as her parents were divorced, and her mother spent a large amount of time in a mental institution. It was said that Tina's biological father was quite eccentric and even kept live goats in the family's basement. That sounds like fun, though.
Yeah, I don't see the problem in that.
Tina's mom eventually remarried after the divorce from her father, and when Tina was 14, her stepfather was charged with raping her and later pled guilty to reduced charges of sexual abuse and endangering the welfare of a child. He was sentenced to 6 months in prison.
Are you kidding me?
After the rape, Tina was separated from her family and would spend the next few years moving from foster home to foster home. During her brief stay with one of her foster families, she was sexually assaulted again, this time by 2 boys who grabbed her and pulled her into a wooded area as she walked home from school. Afterwards, the boys ran away, leaving her lying in the dirt. When she was sure they wouldn't return, Tina got up, collected her belongings, and finished her walk home. She had become so accustomed to assaults that she'd begun to think of the attacks as a way of life.
So sad.
Yeah, it really is. She thought this was the way it was for all young women, and she never reported the incident with the 2 boys. Tina and Tim hadn't been together for very long before Tina had learned that she was pregnant. The couple quickly realized that having a baby wouldn't fit into their current lifestyle, financially, of course, as neither of them worked a full-time job. Tim suggested that they move in with his parents in Hamilton, Ohio. The couple had nowhere else to go, so Tina reluctantly agreed, and the 2 headed to the Midwest, though Tina never really wanted to move. Hamilton was where the father of her baby wanted to live, and Tim's parents were willing to help out. Tim's mother was one of the reasons that Tina was apprehensive about the move. She feared that Miss Bradford would take the baby away after it was born. There was no bias in her fears, just an internal gnawing that wouldn't go away. Something just didn't feel right about Hamilton, and Tina did not have good feelings about the Bradford family. Ignoring the advice of Tina's best friend and her own instincts, Tina packed up her belongings and moved with Tim to the blue-collar city just outside of Cincinnati. Tina was head over heels in love with Tim, and she would follow him to the ends of the earth. Tina should have listened to her friends and to her intuition. Tim's parents were good to Tina and treated her like the daughter they never had, but it wasn't long before she felt like she was living in a foster home all over again, with no privacy and having to abide by someone else's rules. So when Tina and Tim's son was born, she put her foot down and wanted a place of her own to raise the child. Tim agreed and began searching for an apartment, and it wasn't long before he came home with the good news that he found a nice upstairs unit in a duplex just a couple blocks away, which meant that they could have their own space but were still close enough that the Bradfords could spend plenty of time with their new grandchild and help out when needed. Tina and Tim moved into 622 Minor Avenue in Hamilton, only 80 feet away from the Rupert house. Even James Rupert, who was one of the worst killers on record, couldn't imagine the horrors that was about to occur again on Minor Avenue. And he murdered his entire family 2 decades earlier.
Tina and Tim hit it off with their new neighbors, and it seemed like life had finally dealt Tina a new set of cards. For the first time in a long time, she felt as if the world was smiling back at her. Things were going great for the couple until Tim started having trouble holding down a job. He was unemployed and spent most of his days smoking the devil's lettuce, fishing, and using his knives to create his wood carvings. Tim's carefree attitude toward paying the bills and accountability placed the burden of supporting the family entirely on Tina's shoulders. It was a lot of pressure for someone who had already been through so much, or anyone for that matter. Tina's short-lived, seemingly happy life soon morphed into the mundane. Every day was the same. Tina worked while Tim was busy getting high with his friends. He'd even started abusing prescription Ritalin. He had grown his hair into long dreadlocks, and when he wasn't firing up a joint, he was puffing away on menthol cigarettes, which was another expense they couldn't afford on one salary. Just to be clear, we are not being judgy. We are simply giving you the full picture. Tina was a very dependable worker. She was always on time and never missed a day. Her coworker said that she was a responsible go-getter who would do anything for anyone, so it was a real shock to them all when Tina didn't show up to work on the morning of June 4th, 1996. The Thriftway employees were even more mystified when days and weeks passed and Tina never returned or picked up her last 2 paychecks.
See, that right there, you would know there was something wrong with me because
Yeah.
I'm getting my money.
Yeah. I worked for that money.
Yeah.
I will be collecting it.
Exactly. Yes. Give me that paycheck.
7 days after Tina had missed work, Elizabeth Bradford showed up to the Hamilton Police Department to report that Tina was missing. Officer R. Horton took the report, and it was a story he had heard many times. Tina had a fight with her boyfriend, left home angry, and never returned. The next day, Tina's report had made its way to the detective division, where it was picked up by Detective Jim Nugent, a tough-as-nails, old-school detective who was well known for his attention to detail and his ability to solve murder cases with very little evidence. As Detective Nugent read the Mott missing persons report, he made a few phone calls to the woman's friends and family in Buffalo, but no one had heard from her in weeks, if not longer. She had disappeared without taking her child. Nugent had a feeling that something bad had happened to Tina. 8 days later, Tina is still missing, with no sign of her anywhere. She still hadn't called anyone or gone by work. Nugent called Miss Bradford, who states that she still hasn't heard from Tina and that she still had her grandchild. She begged the detective not to tell her son that she had contacted police and stated, he has very bad temper. Really bad.
Apparently somebody forgot to put an A in there.
August 9th, a little over a month since Tina disappeared, Detective Nugent decided to drop by the Bradford home unannounced. There, he spoke to Elizabeth and Tim. Tim stated that on the day Tina had left, they had gone fishing at Linden Lake near the sewage treatment plant, and after returning home, they had played a game of Monopoly, and that's when a fight started. Which, I mean, it's Monopoly. There's bound fights.
Always fights. Especially once you start building houses and putting hotels on it. Fuck you.
Family does not matter at that point.
You literally make a $60 property fucking
$8,000.
Yeah. Fucking hate Monopoly. I will not play that game. Don't ask. Not happening.
Things got out of hand. They were yelling and screaming. Tina left, and that was the last time he had seen her. He seemed quite calm as he told the story, but Tim's statements weren't very convincing. The only thing that Nugent was convinced of was that Tim had something to do with Tina Mott's disappearance. So he started following Tim around town, watching him, trying to make him nervous and rattle him. Nugent brought Tim into the police station a couple of times, hoping to hear a confession, but Tim had no intention of confessing to anything. He was calm, collected, and stuck to a story about the argument and that Tina had gotten angry and left. Really bad temper. The detective continued digging into Tina's past. He spoke to officials with the traveling magazine sales company. If you remember, that's where Tim and Tina met. Nugent had learned that Tina had once been hit by a car while making door-to-door sales calls near Omaha, Nebraska. She was transported to an area hospital where x-rays revealed that she'd suffered an injury to her skull. Nugent filed the appropriate paperwork and obtained the Nebraska hospital records. Somehow, he knew that Tim Bradford would slip up. He had to have left some evidence behind somewhere. All the detective had to do was find it.
On August 7th, 1996, T.J. DeJohn and Tim Lyons, both age 12, had been fishing all day at Linden Lake, just a few blocks from where Howard and Elizabeth Bradford lived on Laurel Avenue. Tina was still missing, and Tim Bradford still lived around the corner in the duplex on Minor Avenue. Not having any luck in their normal fishing spot, the boys decided to make one final attempt before daylight ran out. With their fishing gear in hand, the boys made their way back to the duplex, then turned back towards the water at the crest of a long grassy hill until they reached the bottom of the slope, where they headed for a partially hidden pathway in the thick brush, the entrance to a footpath around the sandy edge of the lake. Linden Lake was a secluded place where local kids would go to hang out so they could drink and smoke pot. That's probably where I would have been. It was also private property surrounded by a 6-foot chain link fence, and clearly that didn't stop anyone from staying out. Vandals had cut access holes in the fence where the boys were able to slip through and continued to follow the narrow path around the lake. DeJohn and Lyons had finally reached the best spot on the whole lake to fish. They cast their lines out as far as they could and waited for a bite. After several minutes, without even a nibble, the boys decided to call it quits and head home. Lyons had wound his line about halfway when he felt a sudden pull. He slowly reeled the line, hoping not to lose what would have been the only catch of the day. But instead of a bluegill or a catfish, when his fish finally broke the surface, disappointment quickly set in. Lyons had reeled in what the boys thought was a Halloween decoration. A plastic skull, to be exact. Lyons tossed the skull up on the bank, then headed home. That night, the boys couldn't get the image of the skull out of their minds. Curiosity got the best of them, so they went back to the lake the next day. They found the skull lying exactly where they had left it. A full day of sun had dried it, giving it a bleached look, making it appear more genuine than before. There was no doubt about it. This was not just discarded Halloween decor, but a real human head. Lyons went straight home and told his parents, and his mother called the police. Hamilton police officer Kevin Flannery was the officer who got the call. He met the boys at the duplex where they led him to their find. Officer Flannery looked at the skull for a moment, picked up a small stone, and tossed it at the head. Lyons later stated, quote, "The cop was irritated. He acted like a prick, like we had caused him a bunch of work or something. He just chucked a rock at it." What else are you going to do? No. The rock struck with a clunk that didn't sound like it had hit plastic. Flannery knew immediately that the skull was real, and the news of finding a body or even a piece of body brought every available cop to the scene. Detectives summoned the local coroner's on-call investigator, Andy Willis, who was a brand new investigator and was at home when the call came in. This was his first case. Thinking that this could be a big deal, Willis called his boss, Butler County Coroner Richard Burkhardt. Dr. Burkhardt, who had been conducting physicals at New Miami High School for the football team, postponed the remaining exams and headed straight for Linden Lake. Detectives also called the Butler County Sheriff's Office, asking for the assistance of its dive team, and cadaver dogs were quickly brought to the scene. The search for the rest of the body was set in motion. Within 20 minutes of receiving the call, Detective Jim Nugent arrived at the scene. He spoke to Dr. Burkhardt, who said he had thought the skull belonged to a female. He also pointed out that it had been stripped clean by the constantly moving waters and the wildlife in the lake. At first glance, Nugent figured dental records wouldn't help in this case because the teeth were missing. In fact, the entire lower jaw was gone. However, Burkhardt had noticed the presence of upper wisdom teeth that had not erupted prior to the time of death, but were slightly visible at this time because the soft tissue that normally surrounds them had decomposed. Nugent saw a little light at the end of this dark tunnel. He knew that scientists might be able to recover DNA from the molars.
Nugent watched the wetsuit divers break the surface one at a time, shaking their heads, indicating that they had not been lucky in their search. They reported that they found nothing of interest at the bottom of the lake. The water was too dark and murky. Nugent told them to pack it in and called off the underwater search. The cadaver dogs had come up short as well. There were no human remains in the water or in the area surrounding the lake. Gradually, all the searchers and other officers packed up their gear and left the area. Nugent remained behind, standing at the edge of the water, staring out at the lake, dredging up memories of police reports he'd read, missing persons cases, and one case in particular stood out above the rest. He didn't need Dr. Burkhardt to tell him the skull belonged to a female. In fact, he was pretty sure he already knew the victim's name, Tina Mott. He also thought he knew the name of her killer, Timothy Allen Bradford. All he had to do was prove it. Nugent sought out Tim, asking him to come to the police station. There, he again questioned him about Tina's disappearance. Tim was again adamant that he didn't know anything about Tina's whereabouts. Nugent told him about the skull, wanting to see Tim's reaction, but got nothing. So Nugent started over, in case he'd missed something the first time, questioning neighbors, friends, co-workers, Mrs. Bradford, Tina's New York friends, her mother, and anyone who might have come into contact with her. Again, he came up empty-handed. Months had passed and still no one had heard a thing. In the meantime, Detective Nugent contacted forensic anthropologist Dr. Beth Murray from the College of Mount St. Joseph in Cincinnati to see if she could shed some light on the strange markings found on the skull. Dr. Murray agreed to help and quickly discovered several tool marks in the bone, including a large chop mark appearing to have been made from a hatchet. Many of the other marks observed by Dr. Murray appeared to have been made by an instrument with a serrated edge, like the blade of a steak knife or something very similar. There was a great deal of fracturing around the tooth sockets, indicating that the teeth had been forcibly removed. In fact, when viewing the fractures from the right angle, Dr. Murray was able to see the imprint of the ends of a pair of needle-nose pliers. Murray was then convinced that someone had killed this young woman and attempted to hide the victim's identity by removing her teeth. Armed with Dr. Murray's findings and a favorable comparison of the skull to the x-rays taken of Tina during her hospital stay in Nebraska, Detective Nugent was able to secure a search warrant for the home of Tim Bradford. He also obtained a second warrant for a storage unit rented by Bradford. Nugent and his team raided both locations simultaneously. At the house, officers searched the kitchen and seized a set of black-handled knives they found in a matching butcher block. They also seized a large meat cleaver. Luminol tests revealed human blood on the living room carpet. It was also found around the base of the bathtub and around the bottom of the toilet. Investigators searching the storage unit recovered a cutlery set containing 19 knives. Nugent was sure that he finally had the evidence he needed to tie Tim to the skull. But before he could make the arrest, he still needed to identify the skull and positively tie the knives to the murder. He brought the items to Dr. Murray's lab, where they sent core samples of the skull, 2 molars, and a blood sample from Tina and Tim's son to LabCorp in Raleigh, North Carolina for DNA testing. It took a few months, but the results that Detective Nugent and Dr. Murray had been anxiously waiting for were finally back. Nugent began to read, "No comparisons could be made between the tooth samples and the blood samples submitted. Nuclear DNA testing was also attempted on the tooth. However, insufficient DNA was recovered to yield reportable results. Through polymerase chain reaction analysis, the results indicated the maternal relationship between the bone and the skull. In layman's terms, Dr. Murray was able to drill out pieces of the base of the skull that held DNA that can only be linked maternally through a mother and her child, meaning they finally had their match and there was no doubt that this was the skull of Tina Mott. The DNA match meant that Nugent confirmed what he had known all along. Tim Bradford murdered Tina, and he'd tried to cover his tracks by removing her teeth and then tossing her head into Linden Lake. The question still remained. Where was the rest of Tina's body? Once again, Nugent brought Tim in for questioning. This time, faced with the overwhelming evidence against him, Tim cracked and agreed to tell police everything, including where they could find the rest of Tina's body. But there was a catch. He would tell them only if prosecutor Robin Piper agreed to his terms. No murder charge that would force him to serve a lengthy prison sentence with no hope of ever getting out.
So I'm really heated about this. As shitty as it is, he, at this point, has all the power if you think about it.
Yeah.
I mean, sure, they found the knives and the blood on the carpet and in the bathroom, but both could totally be explained.
Yeah.
Defense could say that maybe Tina had a cut on her foot, got blood on the carpet and in the bathroom. Like, I've had a cut on my foot and had blood around my toilet. Like, that shit happens.
Yeah.
I'm also sure she's probably used her kitchen knives before. Like, they could say she got a cut. like while she was chopping vegetables, and the blood soaked into the porous handle. Like, I'm not making excuses. As a crime junkie, I've heard it all. Like, take Candy Montgomery, for example. There was no real evidence that it was self-defense, but there also wasn't any that it wasn't.
Yeah.
Like, if Tim and Tina had gotten into a fight and she left, someone along the way could have easily grabbed her and killed her. So without Tim's confession, there would have been a chance that there would be no justice.
It's true.
Sorry, rant over.
Getting back to the story. Piper and Nugent both wanted Tina to have a proper burial, so after giving the case a lot of thought, and both bothered by the fact that Tina's remains were out there somewhere in a deserted location, Piper agreed to Bradford's terms. There would be no murder charge as long as Tim's information proved to be truthful and that he led them to Tina's remains. Even though Tim had already reached a deal with the prosecutor, Nugent advised him of his rights, reading from a pre-printed form. When he finished, he slid the paper across the table to Tim. Bradford pulled the page closer, adorning it with his signature. He then pushed the paper away and leaned back into his chair. Nugent pulled out a camera, telling Tim he needed a photograph for the record. The killer looked at the camera and cocked his head slightly to the left. The corners of his mouth turned up slightly, giving the hint of a tiny smile. Was Tim Bradford proud of himself? Pleased that, in a way, he'd beaten the system and had literally gotten away with murder, and could now sit face to face with a police detective and tell his story without the fear of going to prison for the rest of his life?
That's exactly what it seems like.
Yep.
Nugent returned the camera to his desk drawer and said, "Tell me what happened, Tim." Tim says, quote, "Tina Mott, who was my girlfriend and the mother of my child, had been fishing by the sewage treatment plant. The plant was adjacent to Linden Lake. After we got home, Tina and I started arguing, like we did a lot. It was about my friends who she didn't like and that she wanted to go home back to New York. Tim then talked about the two of them playing a game of Monopoly and that Tina continued to argue. At some point, she had ran toward him and he said he hit her in the nose and she started to bleed, so she ran to the bathroom to clean up. When Tina returned, she was crying and she immediately began to pack her clothes, saying she was going back to New York. Tim was in the living room picking up the scattered pieces of the game and putting away his fishing tackle. He'd just picked up a filleting knife to put it away when Tina suddenly came charging at him, and as a reflex action, Tim said he swung at her with the hand that held the knife. He said his judgment was off and he didn't realize that Tina was closer to him than he had thought, and the blade accidentally cut her throat and she fell to the floor.
That was an accident.
I accidentally killed you.
Accidentally, man.
Accidents happen. He goes on to say, quote, "I really don't know what happened then. I just ran. I ran to the park, and when I came home, Tina's body was in the bathtub. But I have no idea how it got there. She was dead, and that night I had been doing Ritalin. I was on speed."
She just went to the bathtub to die. Don't know how she got there. She was dead when I left her.
She was dead after I accidentally cut her throat.
Accidentally.
He claimed that all he could think about was that Tina was dead and that he would go to prison for the rest of his life. He was worried that he'd never see his son again. He knew he had to do something to keep from going to prison, so he grabbed the cutlery set. He also picked up a meat cleaver and hacksaw before walking back into the bathroom. Tim looked at Nugent and calmly said, "That's when I started taking her apart. I cut off her head, her arms, her hands, everything. I skinned her whole body while it was in the bathtub. Some of the skin and other stuff I flushed down the toilet."
What the fuck?
Tim told them he placed Tina's internal organs inside plastic garbage bags. Then he picked up Tina's head and started hacking it with a meat cleaver, trying to split it in half. And when that was unsuccessful, he reached for a hacksaw and began sawing the larger limbs and bones into smaller, more manageable pieces. "Oh yeah," Tim said. "I know Tina was dead when I pulled her teeth because I'd already cut off her head. I used a pair of pliers to pull her teeth out, then I put them in a bag with some of the other body parts." He glanced down towards the floor and said, "All my life, I have wanted someone to love, and with Tina, I thought I'd found that person." He paused and looked back at detectives. His voice returned to the strong and in-charge tone, and he said, I skinned her body and put the skin mostly in the bag with other body parts. Then I put everything into a duffel bag and a backpack and walked to the sewage treatment plant. I put them in a field near a row of trees, then I walked home. He stated that when he returned home, he found Tina's head still there, so he carried it to the lake and threw it in, along with the hacksaw, pliers, and filleting knife. He then went home and started cleaning up using bleach and ammonia. He said, I threw away the clothes I had on when I cut up Tina. It was trash night, so the garbage was picked up the next day.
Oh, that's convenient.
Yeah. Way to think on your feet.
Yeah, what a smart guy.
Tim crossed his arms in front of his chest and said, I did not talk to anybody while I was doing this. I did everything myself. Then he slumped back into his seat and was done talking. Detective Nugent and Dr. Murray were never able to recover all of Tina's remains. Due to the months of exposure to the elements and animal scavengers, many of them were lost forever. However, a memorial service was finally held for Tina Mott at the Greenwood Cemetery in Hamilton. Her remains were laid to rest inside a small cardboard box in grave number 49 in the Babyland section of the cemetery. The cost of her burial was $150, paid for by Elizabeth Bradford, the only person to attend the graveside service.
What?
Yeah.
Oh my gosh.
Tim had no explanation as to why he killed Tina other than to say that he loved her and he was sorry. Some speculate that he killed her because he wanted out of the relationship. If the skull would have never been found, the murder would have never been solved, and this would have been recorded as a missing persons case forever. Because of the plea deal, Tim Bradford was sentenced to 12 to 25 years for pleading guilty to voluntary manslaughter. He was also charged with misuse of credit cards, as he stole and used Tina's credit card after he killed her. He was also charged with theft and abuse of a corpse. He entered Ohio's state prison system on September 24th, 1997, just over a year after he murdered Tina, and is currently serving his time at London Correctional Institution in Ohio. He has been denied parole for each hearing, including the last that was in June of 2015. Bradford is scheduled for mandatory release on December 6th, 2023. He will have completed serving his full 25-year sentence.
It's only in 6 months.
Yeah.
He has to get out.
Yep.
Such bullshit.
Mandatory.
When asked about the bizarre murders on Minor Avenue, Tina Mott, and the Rupert family massacre, investigative medium Lane Crosby had this to say. I remotely viewed the inside of the house next door to the one with the brick front porch, the one where the man murdered his girlfriend. There may be a number of spirits there, maybe across the street. However, I see 3 very strong energies. One is a male in his late teens or 20s, and a girl about the same age. The other spirit is an older woman, and I see her watching from the main floor kitchen in the back of the house. The older woman may be crossed over, and she may be there for the younger woman, to protect her and see if she can help her cross. The younger man and woman see each other, but I'm not sure if they know of the older woman. Crosby had never been to Hamilton, nor was she given any background information about either of the cases. If you remember back to episode 1, where we revealed that Rupert's mother was in the kitchen when he shot and killed her, and interestingly, the house directly next to Tina's former apartment does indeed have a large brick front porch. Tina's former neighbors say they sometimes see Tina late at night passing by the windows of her old apartment. Her former landlord eventually moved into Tina's upstairs home. He says he still sees Tina or feels her presence in the apartment from time to time, but she moves on once he acknowledges her existence. A former next-door neighbor said Tina once told her that she never liked living across the street from the Rupert house because people had been murdered there and the thought of being murdered gave her the creeps. Another neighbor firmly believed that Bradford consumed portions of Tina's flesh after cooking it on a grill outside on the balcony. The upstairs apartment where Tina lived and died burned in April 2020. The fire started on the balcony.
Tim Bradford acknowledged his guilt in an exclusive letter that he wrote to Forensic Files. While Tim sits in prison, he wrote to producers, and in the letter he states, I have committed an atrocity in the eyes of God and of man, and for that I accept full responsibility. He also writes, my actions belied my true feelings for Tina. I truly loved her with every fiber of my being.
Yeah, as you showed us.
Thanks. You really loved her.
So much.
He claims the pain of his actions go well beyond those imposed by his prison sentence. He says, the nightmares I have had since that night, the dreams I have where I wake up to Tina's name on my lips, those will stay with me forever, and they should. It is a burden I must carry in my heart until the end of my days. As for Tina and Tim's son, we are not going to disclose his name, but he is alive and well. He is a remarkable person with a heart of gold. He resembles both his parents, and he knew what happened to his mother growing up. And as we stated earlier, Tim Bradford is set to be released from prison on December 6th of this year. We are tracking his release updates and will keep you posted.
Well, I managed to eat an entire pack of Oreos.
I had 3 of them.
Okay, so an entire pack minus 3.
Okay. All I'm saying, though, is my fiance is a knife user enthusiast, and those are his words, not mine. He literally has thousands of dollars in knives. I'm talking like 25 knives. And after this case, I'm so grateful that the thought he would ever kill me has never crossed my mind. But in the event that I ever do go missing, there's a big orange case in my room. Check there for the murder weapon.
Noted. So, I mean, moral of the story, never play Monopoly.
Yes. No. No. What part of Milan? What part of
Milan?
Yeah. What part of
Let's get down to business.
What part of the Monopoly game do you think it was that caused the fight? Like, who got to be the thimble, or?
I think it was somebody landed on, what is it, Boardwalk?
Yeah.
Boardwalk with, like, a hotel on it.
Oh.
Bankrupt the shit out of them.
Yeah. I seriously hate that game. No, let's talk about this case, though. What did you find interesting about it?
I mean, the fact that he claims he loves her so much, but, like, meticulously skinned her alive with so many fucking knives and a meat cleaver and an axe on, just made sure every little piece of her was gone.
Yeah.
Like, even taking the time to pull out every single tooth. Well, obviously not every single one, but the ones that he thought were all there.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, he tried to, like, split her skull up into pieces, and that didn't work. A part that didn't get mentioned was that her lower jaw, it was completely missing, but it was, like, forcefully removed.
Ugh.
Yeah. I mean, I understand that, like, stabbings are considered crimes of passion, and he was high, but the thing that pisses me off the most is the fact that the prosecutor agreed to that plea deal.
Yeah.
You
like,
know?
oh, yeah, just confess to it, and you could get 12 years.
Yeah, 12 to 25.
Yeah.
And I mean, I know I had, like, mentioned earlier that, you know, he really had, like, the ball in his court. Like, he had all of that power. If they didn't have his confession, there was at that point, there was just a 50-50 chance that he might not have been convicted of anything.
Yeah, because they just had the circumstantial evidence.
Yeah.
So
you know, it's like,
have any hard
oh yeah, we found the knives and there was her blood on it. But again, like,
it could have been a whole number of reasons.
Yeah. You know, she lived in the house. There's reasons why her blood could be in the living room. There's reasons why her blood could be around the bathtub and around the toilet, because it was just small, like, traces, like a drop of blood. You know, it wasn't like,
even like puddles.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
So it's like, it could easily be explained.
Yeah.
You know, it just breaks my heart.
Yeah.
And then for nobody to show up at her funeral.
Yeah, like, only the fucking murderer's mother was the only one to show up.
Yeah, and she paid for the burial. Yeah. But she also, if you notice, she's the one that had made the missing persons report too.
Yeah, she's the one who called the cops.
There's just a lot in this that really makes me sick to my stomach.
Yeah.
This was a fun one.
Yeah. Fun deep dive.
Yeah.
We hope that you enjoyed this deep dive. I know we were super excited to bring this one to you. As you know, next week is Father's Day, and we did Killer Moms for Mother's Day, so of course we have to do Killer Dads too. As always, we would love to hear from you if you have a birthday coming up or have a case recommendation. You can email us at thickthighsmurdervibes@gmail.com and on Facebook at Thick Thighs and Murder Vibes Community. Bye!